Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Devisha. I am a faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today we are going to cover the module on Introduction to Vulnerability, the paper Environment and Society. Basically, today we are going to cover the concept of vulnerability, its various dimensions and its linkages to sustainable development. The contents of today's discussion would be thus: the introduction to vulnerability, dimensions of vulnerability, vulnerability framework, which is the PAR model, and linking sustainable livelihoods, risk and vulnerability. Let's start with the concept of vulnerability. What is vulnerability? Vulnerability is a term used to describe exposure to risk and to hazards and shocks. People are more vulnerable if they are more likely to be badly affected by events outside their control. Vulnerability has to be viewed in its multifaceted nature, and the concept of vulnerability has achieved a high degree of recognition in different fields such as disaster management, environmental change research and development studies. Vulnerability represents the system or community's physical, economic, social or political susceptibility to damage or as the result of a hazardous event of natural or anthropogenic origin. There are various types of vulnerability. Now, vulnerability of place, vulnerability of an hazard, gender and age, vulnerability and risk, and social vulnerability are various aspects that we are going to look upon. We are going to start with vulnerability and hazard. What is vulnerability and hazard? Now, vulnerability has been a commonly used term in disaster science research. For several years, disaster studies focused on accurately predicting the nature of a hazard and finding technological solutions to prevent or mitigate it. For example, river systems are studied to predict intensity of floods. Natural hazards such as cyclones, earthquakes, forest fires, volcanic eruptions were seen as potential damaging disasters. If not predicted or prevented well in advance, these can be highly dangerous. Vulnerability of place is the next type of vulnerability that we are going to look upon. The risk of specific natural hazards varies widely from region to region. For example, the east coast of India witnesses more cyclones than the west coast, owing to the shape of the West Bay of Bengal. Now, Himalayan region, which is relatively new in geological terms, has more earthquakes than other mountain regions like the Western Ghats. There are geographical and climatic regions for some places being more at risk than others. Now, the vulnerability of place can be calculated by study of trends of events over time. Knowing the hazard of place keeps in taking preventive measure. For instance, areas of high flood risk can be marked as no development zone. Building specifications can be made for earthquake resistant housing in areas of high risk from earthquakes. These measures help in minimizing effects of disasters on human lives in the risk zone per se. Now, the next aspect that we will be looking upon is the social vulnerability. A technical view of disaster limits our understanding of the subject per se. So, instead of defining disaster primarily as physical occurrences requiring largely technological solutions, disasters are better viewed as a result of complex interactions between potentially damaging physical events. Example could be floods, droughts, fire, earthquakes and storms, and the vulnerability of a society and its infrastructure, economy and the environment, which are determined by human behavior. Now, example of an earthquake can basically cause heavy damages in an urban slum, which has makeshift houses, high density of humans and poor infrastructure. But the same flood will hardly have an effect on affluent housing society, which has durable housing, fewer people, and good quality infrastructure, which can withstand a earthquake per se. Next aspect we are going to look upon is gender and age. Risks to women are relatively high than those of men in all hazardous situations. For example, the clothes that women wear do not help them to swim, for example, when a flood comes. In addition, they are most often responsible for children and cannot abandon them in disaster situations. Small children, aged and disabled are more at risk in case of disasters as they cannot respond fast to the possible dangers. Now, another aspect here is the tribals. 67 tribes in India are listed as particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now, these are mainly groups living in pre-agricultural stage, having remained mostly isolated from other populations. Special efforts are done to protect them from risk posed by rapidly changing world. Rights of tribals to access forests, water, land and self-decision are recognized by the Indian law. Another aspect is the vulnerability and risk. Now, compared to the terms hazard and vulnerability, the term risk can be described as the product of interaction between hazard and vulnerability. The pressure and release model views disaster as the intersection of two major forces. These processes generating vulnerability on one hand, and on the other the natural hazard event happens. Now, I would be basically explaining more on the PAR model. Now, the vulnerability framework here is the PAR model, that is the pressure and release model. It underlines how disasters occur when natural hazards affect vulnerable people. Now, the PAR approach is based on the common used equation, that is risk equal to hazard into vulnerability. In this context, vulnerability is defined within three progressive levels. One is the root cause, dynamic pressures and unsafe conditions. Now, this figure you will be able to see the progression of vulnerability, which is divided into root causes, dynamic pressures and unsafe conditions. This leads along with this, when a hazard strikes, it basically creates a risky situation for the poor. First, we will be looking at the first box, which is the root causes. Root causes can be, for example, economic, demographic and political processes which determine the access to and distribution of power and various resources. Now, these resources causes are also closely linked with the subject of good governance, such as the nature of the control exercised by the police and military and distribution of power in the society. Now, let's come to the aspect of dynamic pressures. What are dynamic pressures? It encompasses all processes and activities that transform and channel the effects of root causes into unsafe conditions, such as failure of agriculture, rapid urbanization, war, etc. Now, failure of agriculture or lack of employment, opportunities, changing economy, ethnic conflicts are some examples of dynamic pressures which affect populations in rural India, and many are forced to migrate for basic needs of survival. Now, if one carefully studies the trends, it is clear that people who are already poor have no economic or political support due to lower social positions and are mostly affected by these pressures. Now, for example, migration due to crop failure, tribals who have lost access to land and forest produces are examples of such situations which people face. Now, let's come to the unsafe conditions. Root causes, dynamic pressures, and now the unsafe conditions. What are the unsafe conditions? Now, root causes implying dynamic pressures lead to unsafe conditions for the poor households, which is the third column in the PAR model frame. Unsafe conditions are specific forms in which human vulnerability is relieved and expressed in a temporal or spatial dimension. Now you can see that there are various unsafe conditions here. Now fragile physical environment, which can be dangerous locations, unprotected buildings and infrastructure. There can also be a fragile local ecology, which includes livelihoods at risk and low income levels. Now the other aspect of unsafe condition would be the vulnerable society in itself. Now special groups at risk or lack of local institutions could be covered in it. Now public action also comes under unsafe conditions, like lack of disaster preparedness, or another would be the public actions. Lack of disaster preparedness or prevalence of endemic disease can also lead to unsafe conditions. Now these conditions can encompass living in hazardous locations or having entitlements that are prone to rapid and severe disruption. Now the people forced to move out of their areas into new locations often end up living in vulnerable places as they have no means or access to safer dwellings. People living in slum of a large city are an example of this. Now this view indicates that measuring vulnerability should go beyond the identification of vulnerability. Rather, it should address underlying driving forces and root causes in order to be able to explain why people are vulnerable. However, the different elements of PAR framework are dynamic in that they are subject to constant change, and hence the task of identifying and verifying the causal links between root causes, dynamic pressures and unsafe conditions in a quantitative way might be very difficult. So it is particularly useful in addressing the release phase and the root causes that contribute to disaster situations. On the other hand, the approach underlines the fact that the real efforts to reduce vulnerability and risk involves changing political and economic systems, since they are viewed as a root cause of, for example, dynamic pressures such as rapid urbanization or rapid population change. Now, situations of slum dwellers reveal a high proportion of people who are from socially disadvantaged classes are forced to live in slums as they cannot afford to live in any other part of the city. When hazard strikes, people living in unsafe conditions will be at most risk of loss of lives and property than those who are living in a safer place or a safer location. Example, slum dwellers versus apartment dwellers in flood conditions. However, if one has to minimize the risk to people, it is not enough to deal with the slum conditions, but to understand and deal with the root causes of social inequity. Now, development organizations who plan intervention has created a model to deal with the progression of vulnerability. It is known as the progression of safety. It views each component of the model and suggests steps that need to be taken to reduce the risk of disaster. Now, here progression of safety, you can see that the first column, it basically addresses the root causes. Now, it addresses the root causes by increasing the access of vulnerable groups to power structures and resources, challenges any ideology, political or economic system that causes or increases vulnerability. Now the second box, we can see that it reduces the pressures. Now by development of local institutions, education, training, appropriate skills, local investment, local markets, press freedom, ethical standards in public life. Now another aspect by which they reduce the pressures is by macro forces, that is population and health programs, manage urbanization, adopt. Another aspect by which we can reduce the pressure is by micro forces, that is through population and health programs, manage urbanization, adapt arms industries for development purposes, reschedule debt repayments, reforestation, etc. Yet again, the third aspect that progression of safety looks at is to achieve safe conditions. How do we achieve safe conditions? It is through protected environment, that is, say, safe locations, hazard resistant buildings and infrastructure, diversification of rural income and opportunities. Now, we can also achieve safe conditions through resilient local economy, by strengthening livelihoods, increase low incomes, etc. Now, public action can also achieve safe conditions through disaster preparedness, early warning systems, etc. So, today's class will sum up. We have covered the vulnerability aspects, what vulnerability is, types of vulnerabilities, and the PER model, which is the vulnerability model, and the linkages between risk, sustainable livelihood, and vulnerability. I hope you enjoyed today's class. For more enhanced reading, you should definitely visit the ePathshala resources. Thank you.